Hey everyone, welcome to Fontanalis. This channel is all about introducing better ways of thinking about the world through models, frameworks, and metaphors. And today's video is about cycles, specifically how cycles are the master of human health. Alright, so in this video I'm going to cover a lot of subjects. I'm going to start with some terminology so that we can talk effectively about cycles, and then I'm going to go into the evolutionary context of cycles and how the modern world disrupts these. And then the meat of this video is going to be talking about how disruption of cycles is actually at the root of all modern chronic disease. Let's talk terminology. So cycles can be best thought of as these sine waves, right? You're going up and down over time between two extremes. Those extremes are referred to as the peak and the trough. So the highest your cycle gets is referred to a peak. It's referred to as a peak, and the lowest it gets is referred to as a trough. And then in between you have the average or the midline. More important than the concept of peak and trough, we have acute and chronic disruptions. So chronic and acute are two different words which are used to refer to two different types of disruptions of a cycle. So when you have a large disruption that's temporary, we call that acute. So if you have a massive spike and then you return back to that baseline or that midline you were at before, that's a chronic disruption. If you have a disruption that lasts a long time, sustained, that's a chronic disruption, right? So if you change that midline so that it's higher than it was before or lower than it was before, or if you change that amplitude so you cause the difference to become smaller, right? Or the difference to become larger and you have a higher amplitude. Those are all examples of chronic disruptions of a cycle. Evolutionarily speaking, humans were at the whims of all sorts of different cycles, and the two master cycles of these are the cycles of day and night and summer and winter, right? So you have the daily and the yearly cycles. I'm not going to get into in this video all the different cycles of hormones and neurotransmitters that happen throughout the day, but what's important to understand is that those cycles happen for a reason, right? So those hormones and neurotransmitters are going to be going up and down, telling you when you should be eating, when you should be working, when you should be socializing, and of course, when you should be sleeping. And so it's important to remember that if we disrupt that master cycle of light and darkness, we're also disrupting all of the subservient cycles that tell us when we should be performing different functions. One of the most important sets of cycles we have is a cycle between what's called anabolism and catabolism, which are just fancy words for growth and repair or decay. So anabolism happens when we eat, when we're full, when there's sugar in our bloodstream, and catabolism happens when the sugar in our bloodstream is low, when we're not getting enough food, etc. Now what's important about this cycle is that both catabolism and anabolism have important functions. So if you're constantly in an anabolic growth state, that's really bad because we didn't evolve in a context of constant growth and constant resources. So both the anabolic and catabolic stages of this cycle are important because we evolved in a context of a constant flux between the two. We were never in a constant anabolic state, just as we were never in a constant catabolic state. The circumstances just didn't exist for that to happen, right? So we evolved for all of the functions in our body to rely on this constant switch back and forth. Even if you had, say, a really good summer, you wouldn't be in that constant state of glut for more than 4 or 5 months. And conversely, even if you had a really bad winter, you wouldn't be without food for more than a couple months at a time. So your body recognizes that every time you go up, you're gonna go back down. Every time you go down, you're gonna come back up. And so your body has built important functions into both of these things. In order to grow muscle cells, in order to get stronger, your body needs to be in an anabolic growth state. But in order to produce stem cells and to repair itself in other ways, the body actually needs to be in a catabolic state, right? And another thing that happens in a catabolic state is is certain processes that downregulate and destroy cancer cells. So both growth and decay or repair are important. So the first step in understanding why modern lifestyles cause chronic disease is to recognize that modern lifestyles involve an excess of excess. Excess is fine when it happens acutely and periodically, but chronic excess leads to chronic dysfunction. Humankind did not evolve in a context of constant excess. There was no time in primordial history where a human went a year constantly being fed and never being hungry. It simply didn't happen. There were droughts, there were famines, and there were failed hunts and winters. So humans were used to this constant up and down and not having an excess. And the excess of the modern world is not limited to food. We also have an excess of light, an excess of stimulus, an excess of flavors, even going beyond the food itself, the caloric value of the food, those flavors and the novelties are unprecedented for the primordial man. Just like it's unprecedented to be able to sit in front of a TV and be entertained constantly for hours on end. So the next thing I want to talk about is calibration and how calibration differs between acute and chronic disruptions. Essentially, our bodies tend to calibrate highly when presented with an acute disruption, and they tend to not calibrate in the presence of a chronic disruption. An example of this is if I overeat by a lot in one sitting, I'm going to feel sick. My body is going to calibrate by telling me I've eaten too much. But if I eat 100 or 200 extra calories in a sitting, that's not enough to trigger my body to say that I've had enough. It's just going to store that extra as fat without thinking too much about it. And exercise works the same way. So if you're constantly walking or, doing a light jog every day, your body's not going to respond very strongly to that. But if you have one really intense half-hour workout, your body's going to respond to that very strongly. So that's the principle between something like high-intensity interval training, right? You're doing very strong 10, 15-second sprints, and that's actually because you're able to push harder. It actually causes a higher response than a much larger total volume of chronic exercise. So this brings us to another concept. In the primordial world, the human body evolved to respond to acute crises. You would periodically have massive gluts and long periods of starvation, and these would cause the highest levels of regulation. In other words, the human body relies on periodic acute disruptions to recalibrate the midline so that we can continue being healthy. So when we see that the modern world is riddled with type 2 diabetes, with cancer, with heart disease, with mental health issues, right, with insomnia, what we're looking at is a lack of acute regulation, acute disruption that causes a recalibration of these metabolic and mental processes. If we constantly have sugar in our bloodstream without an acute disruption of that blood sugar flow, we're going to become desensitized to blood sugar and insulin. When we're in a constant state of anabolic growth, we don't have those clearing away processes being activated which take cancer out of our system. When we're in a constant state of stimulus without any sort of acute stressors, but tons of chronic stressors, we're in a state that is rife for mental health issues. When we're chronically disrupting our light and dark cycles through electronics, it's no wonder that we have so much insomnia. Alright everybody, I hope you liked this video. If you have any questions, please leave them below. And if you want more models, frameworks, and metaphors, please subscribe. I will see you next time.